Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Me, Alif Shimon from Alif Melody Hub. Today I'm with Poetry in Historic Look. This is a research topic. Poetry in Historic Look. Research points. What is poetry? What is poem? Poetry versus poem. Who is poet? Evolution of poetry. Origin of poetry. Ancient history of poetry in different regions in the world. History of poetry, some ancient poets, and socio-cultural conditions with poetic history. History of African poetry. Poems has been presented in Africa since at least prehistoric times with hunting poems and panegyric and elegiac or mournful court poems about the kingdoms of the Nile, Niger, and Volta valleys. Some of the earliest poetry written in Africa dates back to the 25th century BC. Chinese poetry evolved into a sophisticated medium that described life and important events in imperial history. Chinese history of poetry. The classic poems, often known by the original name of odes or poems, are the earliest extant collections of Chinese poetry songs. The collection contains 305 poems and songs dating from the 11th to 7th century. The stylistic development of Chinese classical poetry involves literary and of two coastal cultural styles, usually assigned to fixed periods corresponding to Chinese imperial periods, traditional events of Chinese history. Poems preserved in written form are poetry books. Moreover, there are or were parallel traditions of traditional oral poetry, also known as popular poem or folk poetry or prose. Some of these poems seem to be preserved in writing. Besides classical poetry or Xinjing, simply known as poem or ode, the earliest new texts are Chusi, Southern China songs or poems, especially in the Shan dynasty, Qin dynasty, Han dynasty, and Wang Yi of 2nd century AD. History of Arabian poetry. Arabic poetry was and remains an integral part of Arab identity. The desert where the most Arabs lived became the first study in Arabic literature, especially in Arabic poetry, which was the only literature available at the time. The prose were not well represented in the pre-Islamic literature because there was no systematic form of writing at all developed. The origin of Arabic poetry is the Shaja rhyme. There is no meter in the beginning in Shaja. They sang as the magician spoke in a rhythmic and a rhyme prose-like poem. Shaza is rhyme without meter, is a way to express oneself to give people the impression that they are. The Bedouin of Arabs believed that they had spiritual power and their rhymed words came down from heaven or devil that inspired him to compose poetry. The existing Arabic poetry was transferred from Shaja to Raj, and Raj stands on camel work. Raj earlier was a kind of sound in the camel driver song Hida. Jarji Jaidan writes that Raj is the greatest ancient meter of Arabic poetry. Each paragraph of Raj has a different syntax, like Shaja, but with a balanced rhythm. The word Hadi, the singer, is anonymous with Sheikh, camel rider. The rhythm, the rhyme, the music produce on them the effect of what they call lawful magic, shir halal. The rhymed prose used by the oracles and soothsayers, Kahan, is to be considered the first stage in the development of poetic form in Arabian area. The earliest sources tell us about early Arabic poetry from the 5th century AD. At this point of time, Arabic poetry must have been developed for some time. Arabic literature and poetry came into existence before the arrival of Islam. The intellectual development lies only in the field of poetry in pre-Islamic period. It is called Register of the Arabs. Poetry became the only means of literary expression at that time. The political, ethical, intellectual, and religious meditations of Arabs are scattered in pre-Islamic period. Poetic composition of the dark ages of Arab has come down to us through lonely oral tradition. The exception was the books known as Muallakat, which are committed to writing and were in existence on the wall of Kaaba. Each of these songs won an annual prize at the Ukaz ceremony, and it was colored with gold letters and then hung on the walls of the Kaaba. The early Qasida was a poem intended to convey a message. Ibn Qutayba tried while summarizing the structure of the Qasida in his book Kitabul Shirwa al-Shu'ara. He says that a Qasida was a three-tiered structure. Muhalhil B. Rabia, the Taglib hero of the Basus War, is credited to be the first who composed the long poems Qasida in history of Arabic poetry. Poetry began in the 6th century before Islam came to be a religion. People learned and taught poetry as a cultural tradition. Most likely, it was word of mouth in the audience. One of the leading figures who carried this desire was Ahmed al-Farahidi. He was well known for his poetry in Arabian area. There are two types of poetry in Arabic poetry. In the 6th century, most people offered poetry as wealth and wisdom. One type is romantic poetry. Romantic poetry written in the first centuries was based on truth. Be sure of read the poem in order to know love story behind it. Satirical poetry, the another genre. Satirical poetry or the satirical poem is so wonderful. It's often used to ridicule the virtues of the poet's enemies or rival tribes. An example of this type of poetry would be from Al-Mutanabbi. He was known for his sophisticated and strong eloquence. As early as the 13th century, his poetry was not popular. But today, he attracts many young poetry lovers who enjoy reading his legacy of poetry. The creation of Arabic literature. Most of the native Arabs lived and earned their living in the desert. Because of their close proximity, the desert became the first study in Arabic literature, especially in Arabic poetry, which was only literature available at that time. The prose didn't well represented in pre-Islamic literature because there was no systematic form of writing at all. Shaza is a rhyme without meter, is a way to express oneself and give people the impression that they are. Arabs believed that they had spiritual power and their rhymed words came down from heaven. The Bedouin Arabs believed that every poet had a spirit or devil that inspired him to compose poetry. The origin of Arabic poetry is the Shaja rhyme. If there is no meter in the beginning, they sang as a magician spoke the rhyme and rhythm in prose like poem. Throughout the history of pre-Islamic Arab culture, Shaja is the central sentiment of poetry. The Arabic style was earliest form of Arabic poetry in the past. The first recorded poem is believed to be from Epic of Gilgamesh, written in ancient Sumeria region around 2000 BCE. It tells the story of a legendary Sumerian hero who leaves his best friend in search of immortality. The epic spread across ancient cultures and inspired literature much in later times. Classical Greek and Roman poets such as Homer, Virgil, Ovid, Sappho, Horace, and Pindar laid the foundation for European poetry in Western civilization. Classical and early modern Western tradition. Classical thinkers of poetry used bars to define and test the nature of poetry. Notably, Aristotle's Poetic deals with three types of poetry: epic, comedy, and tragedy. Identified three main forms throughout the Middle East during the Islamic Golden Age. We know Islamic Golden Age was 8th to 13th century, and the work of Aristotle was influential in European Renaissance. Poetry in historical look. I'm now about to the ending of the discussion. Some references I took here. Philip K. Hitti, History of Arabs, Encyclopedia of Islam, Volume 1, Dime J. 2010. A Poetry and Song Approaches to the 19th Century, Rochester, New York. Arabic Poetry, Origin and Development, Miraj Ahmed Miraj, Volume 3. Ibn Qutaybah, Al-Shir wa Al-Shu'ara, Volume 1. Roger Allen, An Introduction to Arabic Literature, Jarji Jaidan, Tariq Al-Lugha Al-Arabia, Volume 1. Richardson W., 2005, Literature of the World, An Introductory Study. Encyclopedia of the Romantic Era, 1760 to 1850, written by Taylor and Francis. Wordul.com/history of poetry. Another one, Wikipedia.org, wiki/lyric poetry history. That's all from my side. Thank you for patience hearing. Thank you very much.